Well, my friends, welcome back to GB 102, Bible Backgrounds. And we're certainly heading down the home stretch now, as this is our second to the last lecture in the course. And because this is the way that we do things, we've got one more people group that we're going to cover. And so in this lecture, we're going to discuss the Romans and the civilization they created around the Italian peninsula that eventually went on to influence the entire Mediterranean world as we know it. So the Romans are just reaching their climax of their power when Jesus of Nazareth is born and comes onto the scene, and his message, this message about a kingdom of God, is going to offer a fascinating challenge to the political and the social status quo that the Romans had created. So keep in mind that this is really just going to be a survey of the Romans, as a detailed look at all of the ways that the Romans affected New Testament, well, that would be an entire class in and of itself. So for now, we're just going to be content by looking at how the geography of the Mediterranean basin and the Roman occupation of the Levant itself shaped the Jewish world where Jesus dwelt and ministered. So if we're going to talk about the Romans, let's start with the beginnings. And by beginnings, I mean the beginnings the way that the Romans themselves viewed their origins. The prevailing legend concerning the founding of their city comes from the historian Tacitus. At least that is one of the legends that survives. It's a rather fanciful tale and tells of how Rome was founded by two twin brothers named Romulus and Remus. These boys are orphans, and they're supposedly raised by a mother wolf. This legend also bequeaths to Rome that they have a Founders' Day in the year 753 BC. And if there's any accuracy to that guess, it would mean that the founding of Rome is roughly on par with the beginning of Isaiah's prophetic ministry of the Old Testament. So they're not really making a claim to be an ancient society. So that's the legend. And as legends go, it's not terribly reliable. Now, the archaeological data paints a very different picture. In Italy and around where will eventually become the city of Rome, we find these scattered people groups, and they're dwelling in the region around the Tiber River. And these settlements will grow and will eventually become the city of Rome. And additionally, there's also historical evidence that suggests that these early Romans were controlled by a people group living to the north of them known as the Etruscans. Yeah, I know it's not quite as impressive as a legend about brothers who learn to fight and rule from a mother wolf, but the evidence points to a much more slow development of the city of Rome. Now, early on in Rome's history, the Roman people will establish a particular system of government for the city known as a republic government. And this meant that all of the free men of the city would elect representatives to govern for them. This system seemed to work well for most involved, as it allowed professional politicians to deal with the day-to-day mechanizations of government, while the rest of the free male population was freed up and allowed to conduct their business elsewhere, content that the government was in good hands. So now, one of the things that made this Roman Republic unique was that in times of war, the rules changed a little bit, and the governing body, the Senate, could invest what's known as the impergium. It's the Latin word where we get the word right to rule, and it's where we'll eventually get the word empire. But the Senate could put the right to rule upon a person and give that person the title of consul. And this basically made them a military general who could give direct orders to the government. And this allowed the government to make very speedy decisions in times of war. The general could just demand men and resources and other legal measures that were needed to make sure that the war went well. And so, needless to say, such a state of affairs quickly tied the strongest aspects of Rome's republican power to the military leaders in times of war. And so as Rome began to expand and take over Italy and northern Africa and Spain and even western Greece, these people who were their generals, the consuls, would begin to wield enormous amounts of political power because they controlled the army and they had this right to rule invested in them. And so eventually the republic fell as numerous successful generals fought to wield this right to rule, this impergium, in perpetuity. And the first truly successful consul to achieve this was a man named Octavius. And he will eventually change his name to Augustus and will name his surname after his uncle, Julius Caesar. So he'll be known as Augustus Caesar. And this man is the first known Roman emperor. But now, before we get ahead of ourselves and start talking about how Rome affected the New Testament, we have to explain what Rome is up to in those 700 years during Israel's Old Testament. And we also have to explain, why didn't Rome play a bigger part in Old Testament history and in intertestamental history? And the big reason is they're fighting these things known as the Punic Wars. Now, these are three major wars lasting from 264 BC all the way until 146 BC. And these are Roman wars fought against the city-state of Carthage. Now, Carthage is a Phoenician city-state that's located on the upper horn of western North Africa in modern day. It would be the country we would call Tunisia today. And as I said, the Carthaginians are descended from the Phoenicians. And as such, they specialized in naval warfare. And so the fighting between Carthage and Rome largely consisted about contested naval battles and control of seaports around the western Mediterranean basin. And the constant strife between Rome and Carthage kept these two naval powers largely occupied on the western end of the Mediterranean Sea. So while all of the intertestamental battles that we learned about last week between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and the Jews with the Hasmonean dynasty trapped in the middle there in the Levant, Rome is fighting on the west side of the Mediterranean, and while they're certainly aware that things are happening in the Greek kingdoms, they're not really at a position to interfere just yet. But at the end of the Punic Wars, again in 146 BC, Rome was left the very clear victor, and they controlled a large chunk of what we would call North Africa, Spain, the island of Sicily, and all of the Italian peninsula, while the city of Carthage was destroyed. And so no one is really left to challenge Rome locally. And when this happens, they begin to look eastward and say, those Greek kingdoms look rather tempting, and they look rather weak compared to us. And so Rome will set their sights towards the east and will begin marching their war machine in that direction. So now, if you recall from last week, the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great was divided into four large chunks. And those chunks, respectively, are the Antagonid dynasty of Macedonia, the Attilid dynasty of northern Greece and Thrace, there's the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, and there's the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Now, Rome desired to conquer all of this, but unlike Alexander the Great, the forces of Rome were content to just gobble up a little bit at a time and slowly and surely take over these empires. So the Antagonid kingdom was the first to fall in 168 BC at the Battle of Pydea. There's the Attilids, and they were second to go without a battle in 129 BC, shortly after the fall of the city of Corinth. The Seleucids, they were more of a powerhouse, and they took longer to fall, but even then, 70 years later, by 63 AD, the Roman general Pompey is able to conquer the Seleucid kingdom. And when he does this, he's going to bring all of Israel under direct Roman control as well. Now, since Israel was a distant vassal state on the very eastern edge of the Roman Empire, the Romans found it was more convenient to rule the area by placing a king on the throne, but a king who would be very loyal to the Romans. So if you could picture this, they say, we would like this king to govern this territory, and we'll even call him a king, but everyone understands this king reports to Rome, and he's loyal to Rome. And these kings are known as client kings, since they owed all their power to the patronage of the Roman emperor. And so the most successful of these client kings we're going to look at is Herod the Great, who reigned from 37 BC to 4 BC. And this is also, by the way, if you're wondering who the villainous Herod is in the Matthean Gospel, who attempted to kill Jesus as a baby, that would also be this client king, Herod the Great. So, one of the most important things I want you to understand is that the growth and the development of the Roman Empire took a good 300 years to reach its maximum size. And this is in contrast to the rise of Alexander the Great's empire, which was conquered in a very short span of time over the span of Alexander's 13-year military career. And so Rome's slow process of empire building allowed Rome to have a lot more stability. They could subdue an area. They could settle colonists. They could gradually Romanize the area and then move on. And so what this amounts to is that instead of having a very large kingdom of many diverse people groups, the people groups will start to have more in common because they've been explicitly Romanized. And the end result of this entire political machine is that Rome was able to survive a lot more turmoil. And because of this, the western half of the empire is going to last all the way until 476 AD. So keep that in mind. The Roman Empire was much more equipped to withstand change and external pressures because they had a slower empire building process. So, now that you've got all that in mind, let's take a good look at the geographical region that we'll call the heartland of the Roman Empire, which is the Italian peninsula. So, download your thumbnail map from the LSS, and we'll get this train wreck a-rolling.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map.
I'm the map, I'm the map. Hey, welcome back. So, the Roman heartland thumbnail map should look like this. And keep in mind that Italy is that boot-shaped peninsula there in the center of the map. So as always, let us begin by noting the major bodies of water on this map. So get out your blue coloring implement, and let's begin the coloring. So, starting with the western coast of the Italian peninsula, we find a body of water known as the Tyrrhenian Sea. This is a shallow body of water, and it's not populated by all that many islands. It's going to have two big ones, Corsica and Sardis, and we don't have them pictured here on the map, because ultimately those two islands are not going to be all that important to the story of the Bible. But like the Greeks, the Romans are going to stretch their sea legs early on, and they're going to begin by exploring the coastal areas and delivering armies and other foreign materials to their various holdings by boat. But unlike the Greeks, this lack of intermediate islands to keep hopping to and fro is going to cause the major city of Rome to become a centralized city. It's going to be a place where all the power just kind of sucks into that center city. So, in this case, there's going to be two main cities that are going to become the powerhouses in the West because of this lack of kind of island mobility. And that's going to be the city of Rome in Italy and the city of Carthage in North Africa. So next we want to locate the Adriatic Sea, and that's on Italy's eastern coast. And you'll notice that that sea also connects to Greece's western coast. And this is the primary body of water that separates Greece from the Roman mainland. And when Rome begins their maneuvers towards Greece, it will both be via land going around the Adriatic, and it's going to be via the water going through the Adriatic. And then, of course, we've got the big blue monster at the center of our map, and this is the Mediterranean Sea. And within the sea, we'll find two islands of note in the Bible. One is the island of Sicily. That's the big island just off the boot of Italy. And then there's a smaller island known as Malta. And these strategic points became Rome's essential staging areas for the Punic Wars. That as they're fighting Carthage, these main islands will be kind of the waypoints where armies will transfer to and fro. And as I suggested, these islands also played prominently in Acts chapter 27 and 28, as Paul will visit both of these islands as he's going on his way to Rome to stand trial before the Emperor Nero. And also, keep in mind that the Mediterranean Sea does not have easily defined borders between itself and the Tyrrhenian Sea and the Adriatic Sea. These are more constructs based upon Roman assessment and their relationship to the waters. But in all, all three of these bodies of water are not divided by barriers. they just flow one into the other. So now that we've got the big bodies of water, we need to be aware of two major rivers on this map. The northernmost river is known as the Po River, and it runs southeast from the Alp mountain range into the Adriatic Sea. So you'll want to draw it like I have it shown here, with this little blue line coming from the top middle of the map running into the Adriatic. And the second river you want to know is the Tiber River. And this river will run south from the Apennine Mountains, which run all the way through the center of Israel's boot, kind of like a spine. And this Tiber River is going to run south through the mountains, through the city that is marked as the city of Rome, and it will drain out into the Tyrrhenian Sea. And so, speaking about those mountains, let's get out the purple marker now, and let's note where the Alps mark the northern border between Italy and the rest of continental Europe. Now, these lofty peaks are often known as alpine peaks, and we get the idea that these are very tall mountains from the fact that the alpine mountains, the Alps, are very tall, some of them towering over 10,000 feet. And this will keep Italy marginally safe from the Germanic barbarian tribes from the north. Now, the word barbarian just simply means they didn't speak Latin or Greek, but these Germanic tribes would have posed much greater problems if they could have easily invaded into Italy. So, every so often, the Alps will play a central role in Roman history. For example, Hannibal, one of the generals of Carthage in the Punic Wars, tried to cross the Alps with his army and even wore elephants. But Julius Caesar is probably the most famous of the daring Alpine crossing, when him and his legions will invade Gaul, modern-day France, and when he comes back to take over parts of Italy, he'll cross the Rubicon River and cross over the Alps to get there. And so the next important mountain range on this map is the Apennine Mountains. And as I suggested, this is a chain of mountains that runs all the way through the boot of Italy like a spine, kind of like how in the Levant the central mountain ridge ran down the Cisjordan side of the Levant like a spine. And so Romans will not be afraid of attacks coming from the north because of the Alps, and they won't be afraid of attacks coming from the east because of the Apennine Mountains. And these two mountain ranges are going to shield Rome from a lot of other hostile cultures, both from the north and the east. And it's going to make it a very well-protected civilization. And because it's protected, the civilization can grow, it can consolidate its power, and it had the potential to become a major city simply because of its protected vantage point. And our last mountain I want you to get with your purple marker here is the volcanic peak known as Mount Vesuvius. This mountain erupted in 79 AD, and it resulted in the destruction of two Roman cities, Pompeii and Heracleum. And we have very vivid descriptions of this destruction and this eruption from a man known as Pliny the Younger. He's called Pliny the Younger because his older uncle, Pliny the Elder, will die in this eruption. And Pliny gives an interesting first-hand account of the eruption and how his uncle died bravely trying to evacuate the people. So these are the things that I want you to know mountain-wise. I want you to know where the Alps are in the north, the Apennines running down through the central boot of Italy, and then Mount Vesuvius just a little bit north of the second dot on the Italian boot, and that is for the city of Pompeii. And last but not least, and since we've already marked two of them, we might as well get all of the major Roman cities marked as well. So get out your black pen and first mark the city of Rome itself. That's the northernmost city dot that should be drawn on the banks of the Tiber River. Now to the south from there, we have the city of Pompeii, and that'll be just south of the mountain Vesuvius. And next, we want to go on to the southwestern edge of the Italian boot. We're going to find the city of Rhegium. And in Acts 28:13, Paul traveled through this city while he was on his way to stand trial before Nero. Likewise, off the coast of Italy, we're going to find those two islands that I mentioned, Sicily and Malta. And we want to note that on Sicily, there's also a major port city known as Syracuse. And Paul will visit that city in Acts 28:12. And the smaller island of Malta will also become Paul's temporary home for about 3 months because he'll be shipwrecked and he'll have to stay there till they can get another boat. And then the last city I want you to know is the city of Carthage, and it's there on the southern end of the map on the northwestern African tip. So go ahead and pause your video here and make sure you have all the cities marked like I've asked. Rome, Pompeii, Rhegium, Syracuse, and Carthage. And so now that you've got all of your map filled in, take one more second to pause the video and make sure that your map looks like the completed map that we have shown here. Once you're done coloring your map, turn back to your notes and we'll get ready to discuss 3 different ways that Roman culture and politics affected the text of the New Testament. So as we're changing gears from geography, I need to stress just from the onset that we can only get to a few cultural and political factors. Indeed, the amount of information about the Romans and the way that their culture intersected with Christianity is so utterly vast that we can only possibly get to a few things in a class like this. And if we wanted to cover it all, we'd probably have to make an entire school curriculum, not just a class, in order to cover all the ways Rome interacts with the early Christians and the political, social, and just theological consequences of that dynamic interaction. And so we're going to have to pick and choose very, very carefully what we discuss. And so for the sake of brevity and for the sake of clarity, I've picked out 3 topics that I think loom particularly large in the New Testament. And these topics are the cult of the empire, or the imperial cult, the family of the Herods, and a practice of capital punishment that we would call crucifixion. So let's start off by discussing the imperial cult and a very cryptic passage from the New Testament, Revelation chapter 2. In this passage, John, the elder who is writing this letter to a group of Christians living in the city of Pergamum, and John will commend these Christians living in Pergamum for their faithful witness that even though they're facing very intense persecution, and one of their own members, a guy by the name of Antipas, has been killed for his faith in Christ, they've managed to survive and witness successfully in this city. But he'll also say, you managed to survive in this city even though there's, as he calls it, Satan's throne is there. And this has prompted some speculation. What is meant when he says Satan's throne is there in the city? And today, most scholars believe that this passage is referring to what we would call the temple of Zeus at Pergamum. And you're probably also wondering, okay, so Zeus is a pagan deity. What does a pagan temple have to do with either Satan or the Roman emperors? And the simple answer is this. It's called the imperial cult, and it will be tied to almost every major temple in the ancient Near East under Roman control. And at this temple, it was very common for a person to burn incense in honor or worship of the past Caesars and even the current emperor, and to worship them as though they were gods. In fact, when John wrote the book of Revelation, the reigning emperor at the time would have been an emperor called Domitian. And this Emperor Domitian insisted on calling himself Lord and God, according to the historian Suetonius. Domitian was also infamous for reviving the cult of the emperors, which demanded that all common citizens were to offer a sacrifice on behalf of the emperor as though he were a god. And this seems to be what John is getting at in Revelation chapter 2. The altar of Zeus was a well-known place where emperor worship was conducted. And if you're a good Roman citizen, you participated in the emperor cult. And apparently, many Christians in Pergamum, including John himself, apparently fell victim to the emperor's wrath for refusing to play along with this system. And they're probably refusing to play along by making a very interesting claim that instead of Domitian, Jesus of Nazareth was their Lord and God. And John, from the book of Revelation, isn't going to be the only Christian who challenges this idea of emperor worship. Nearly all of the New Testament takes for granted that a good Christian would not worship the emperor. And so, Every emperor from the Julio-Claudian dynasty is posthumously venerated. That means that when they died, they would become or be declared gods by the people. And even a few emperors of that dynasty, such as Nero and Caligula, didn't wait to die to take the title of divine son of God. And so the emperors will take all of these divine-oriented titles. They'll call themselves the divine son of God. They'll call themselves things like the savior of humanity. And every one of these claims is challenged in the New Testament with this bold assertion that Jesus is Lord and Savior, not Caesar. And this powerful counterclaim made the Christian seem rather subversive to the existing Roman government. To the Roman, a Christian could not claim that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God, King of the Jews, and Savior of the human race without implying something very, very serious, that Caesar was not. And so here's the rub. Even with all this talk, Christians did not actively partake in an armed rebellion against the Romans. And my speculation is this caused a lot of confusion for the Romans for several reasons. One, the Christians were originally acknowledged as an offshoot of Judaism, and the Romans firmly believed that the Jews in general were a revolting people, that they were a kind of people that didn't play well with others and didn't submit to the yoke of foreign empires easily. That was at least the Roman consensus. And this is largely confirmed after many, many years of riots and the revolt that started in 66 AD. Secondly, the Christian rhetoric promoting Jesus as Lord and Savior was a common way for other groups to begin an insurrection. You would challenge Rome by saying, "We've got a new champion, and he can challenge Rome's might. He can be our Lord. He can be our Savior, not Caesar." So in short, the Christians are saying and doing everything that Romans expected of a good rebel body or a good insurrectionist group, except that they never actually engaged in an armed rebellion. And so to the Romans, this mixture of anti-Roman talk, but yet pro-Roman law abiding, must have seemed very strange indeed. And if you want to read more on this topic, I highly recommend a book called Jesus is Lord, Caesar is Not. And the articles in this book will explain very well how New Testament scholars deal with the ins and outs of the way the Christians talked in pro and con concerning the Roman Empire. So now that we've mentioned the imperial cult, let's mark all the specific Roman emperors that actually appear in the biblical text. The first is Augustus Caesar, and he's mentioned in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2. He's the emperor who is on the throne when he ordered the registration of all of his empire subjects so that they could be taxed. The emperor following Augustus, Tiberius, is mentioned in Luke chapter 3, and he's going to basically be the emperor on the throne the entire time of Jesus' earthly ministry. So the first two chapters of Luke cover the reign of Augustus, while the rest of Luke covers the reign of Tiberius. Now, a third emperor is mentioned, known as Claudius, and he's mentioned in Acts 18, 2 through 4. And he's remembered for issuing a decree that all of the Jews of the city of Rome are to be removed. And the historian Suetonius also describes this incident, and he implies that a person named Chrestus was involved in the Jewish unrest in the city that eventually led to the expulsion of the entire people group. And for us as Bible readers, this raises an interesting question. Was this unrest due to Jewish and Christian groups arguing over about Jesus not being Christus, but being Christ? Or is it like Suetonius says, that there was a Jew named Chrestus causing trouble? Well, we'll leave that question up for debate for now. But the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors that are mentioned in the New Testament is Nero. And I say mentioned, but in reality, he's just simply referred to as Caesar. Anytime Paul says, "I appeal to Caesar," Nero is the emperor on the throne at the time, so he would be the Caesar that Paul appeals to. And additionally, Nero is remembered as a ruler who was both very cruel and unkind to the Christians in general, and will be remembered for having Paul the Apostle and Peter the Apostle put to death somewhere around 68 AD, just before the end of his reign. And that's all according to the church historian Eusebius. So, after Nero passed away rather suddenly with a lot of civil unrest and fanfare, that civil unrest will continue for about 18 months, where 4 different emperors are going to come to power. Now, after that 18-month period, there's going to be a settling down when a new general is going to take over the Roman Empire, and it's going to start a new line of Roman emperors called the Flavian emperors. And the first of the Flavian emperors is named Vespasian, and he's going to come to the throne in 69 AD, the year before the Jewish temple was destroyed. Now, Vespasian and his son Titus are not mentioned in the New Testament, but they'll still play a very critical role in Jewish history because of their participation in the Jewish war that was described by Josephus in the textbook that you had to read. And Titus, in particular, has the dubious honor of finishing those wars with his sieges of Jerusalem and then later at the site of Masada. And so the last point of contact with the empire and the New Testament is also going to be the last of the Flavian emperors, and that's Domitian. And Domitian is going to do an interesting thing. He's going to look around his empire and he's going to see a lot of problems in his empire, and he's going to conclude Rome is going downhill because Rome has begun betraying and abandoning the traditional Roman gods, and they've also been neglecting emperor worship. And so because of that, he's also going to start looking at, well, what are the citizens replacing their old-time religion with? And they're replacing it with what are often known as Eastern mystery cults, like the cult of Isis, and they're also replacing it with this new form of Judaism known as Christianity. And so all of his policies are going to lead Domitian to make a first really concerted effort to persecute Christians all across his empire. There's always been local persecutions during these times, but this is going to be the first time where an emperor is going to basically say, every Christian in my empire needs to get with the program. And the Christian historian Eusebius records that Domitian had John the Apostle boiled in hot oil, for example, and somehow this didn't kill him. And so Domitian is then going to send the aged apostle all the way to the island of Patmos to work in the mines there. And this is where the book of Revelation will be written. And so many scholars currently believe, and I'm in agreement with them, that the bulk of the book of Revelation's contents is aimed at critiquing Domitian's reign. So now that we've talked about the Caesar emperors, the next big point of contact I want to mention between Rome and the New Testament is the line of client kings known as the Herodians. And they're called this because they're all descended from a specific Herodian, Herod the Great. Now, several aspects about the Herodians make discussions concerning them, we'll call it complicated. The first issue is that the Herodians were known as client kings. They held the title of king, but they're always subservient to the Roman emperor. If they weren't, they didn't last all that long. And as you've already read in Josephus, these kings were dependent on Rome for their power, and individual members of the Herod family could be raised or lowered depending on who was making Rome happy or happiest at the time. And some of these other titles you will see, not every Herodian will be called a king. Sometimes they'll have the title of ethnarch, which means ruler of a people group, or tetrarch, which means that the kingdom has been divided into 4, tetra, and 1/4 of the kingdom has been given to a particular Herod. So if the titles weren't bad enough, king, tetrarch, ethnarch, if these aren't confusing enough, eventually the Herods will also come up with an interesting naming convention. Herod the Great was the first major Herod, and like the boxer George Foreman, he's going to name all of his children after himself. So as George Foreman has kids, George Jr. through George the Fifth, I believe, Herod is going to have all of his children named Herod. And all of their kids are going to name their kids Herod, or some variation of Herod. So in the Bible, you'll read about Herod the Great. You'll read about Herod Philip the First. You'll read about Herod Antipas. You'll read about Herod Agrippa the First. You'll read about Herod Agrippa the Second. And often the Bible will just say, that's Herod. And the Bible will assume you know which Herod they're talking about. And sometimes the Bible will help you out by giving an additional name to help, tell which one is which. And sometimes it'll just go, and then Herod appeared, or Herod said something, and it'll expect you to know what you mean. So with all this in mind, let's look up the 8 major Herods that appear in the biblical text. And so, starting with the first of the Herods, we have Herod the Great. And I probably can't stress this enough, but Herod the Great was great in nearly every sense of the word, both good and bad. Concerning wealth, he'll build up the Jerusalem temple into one of the largest temple complexes the Roman world had ever seen. And that was just one of his major building projects. When Herod died, according to Josephus, he'll leave 10 million pieces of silver to his friend Augustus Caesar, and he'll leave another 5 million pieces of silver to just one of his wives named Julia. Now, concerning family, Herod's going to have 10 wives, and anywhere you have a guy with 10 wives, he's going to have numerous children. And as I mentioned before, a lot of them are going to have the name Herod in some form. Now, Herod's 3 oldest children, Herod Antipater, Herod Aristobulus, and Herod Alexander, were all put to death because they had in some way, shape, or form plotted against their father to try to gain his throne. And this tendency to murder others, including his own family, when power is on the line, is going to be a hallmark of Herod the Great. And we'll see this even in the Gospel of Matthew, where Herod is told that a group of Persian magi are in town saying, "Where is this newborn king of the Jews?" And Herod's going to say, "There's only one king of the Jews here, and that's me." And he'll try to kill Jesus as a baby. And while we're talking about Herod's mental problems, let's talk about his madness. Herod is, according to all sources, a unique form of crazy. After reading Josephus last week, you probably went numb from all of the crazy things Herod the Great did. He constantly suspected his wife, Merimee, of having an affair with his uncle and his brother when he didn't have any proof. And on his deathbed, for example, he had numerous people taken prisoner and ordered them to be executed on the day of his death just because he wanted the people to have a good reason to cry at his funeral. So that was Herod the Great. But as we mentioned, Herod had a tendency to put anyone who challenged his power to death. And he put his 3 oldest children to death, and his 4th oldest child was safe in Rome, but he disinherited that child as well. And so his 5th son, by his 4th wife, will become heir to Herod's great kingdom. However, this son, by the name of Archelaus, was highly unpopular because early in his reign, there's a riot, and about 3,000 pilgrimaging Jews are going to be killed under Archelaus' orders. Eventually, the public outcry against Herod Archelaus became so great that Augustus Caesar had to depose him and will send him to exile in Gaul, which is today southern France. And Herod Archelaus, a man born and raised in the land of Judea, will die in southern France. Now, Herod Archelaus intersects with the New Testament in 2 very interesting passages. The first is in Matthew 2:22, and he's mentioned by name as ruling over the land of Judea as the ethnarch. His presence there is going to be enough of a threat that Mary and Joseph won't settle down in his kingdom, and instead they'll move all the way north to Galilee, to the city of Nazareth, just to avoid his jurisdiction. Now, the second reference to Herod Archelaus is a little bit more vague, but it comes from Luke's version of the parable of the talents. A nobleman goes away, and he is to receive a kingdom. And this is exactly what Archelaus did in 4 BC. He had to travel to Rome, meet with Augustus Caesar, and have him be appointed king once his father was dead. And this is what makes Jesus' particular parable so provocative. He's essentially saying, like Archelaus, I'm going to have to leave, in Jesus' case, meaning he's going to have to die, rise from the grave, and ascend to heaven in order to receive his kingdom. And also, like Herod Archelaus, Jesus is promising when he returns with his full authority, there's going to be a reckoning, both of the loyal servants, that's the church, and the rebels who do not want him to be king in the first place. Everybody else. So our next Herod up for discussion is probably the most confusing for scholars of the New Testament. According to Josephus, Herod II was in Rome when his father Herod the Great passed away, and Herod II has displeased his father greatly, but this distance from his father is going to largely save him from being executed with his 3 older brothers. But because of this distance, Herod the Great is going to basically say, Herod II, you have no rights to any part of my kingdom or inheritance. And so, because of this, Herod II has no kingdom, and no coins or portraits of Herod II exist. And there's also this other confusion that this Herod, Herod II, in the New Testament is mentioned in Matthew 14:3 and Mark 6:7, but he's called Philip. And so modern scholarship is quick to note the difference between this Herod Philip, Herod II, who has no kingdom, and his brother, who's also called Herod Philip, who ruled over the land of Britannia. Now, one thing that this Herod is known for is his cheating wife. Are you ready? Herodias. That's right. She's also related to Herod the Great. This first wife of Herod II is his niece. Herodias is the daughter of his older brother, Herod Aristobulus. It is kind of uncertain why she left him. My guess is she left him because one of his other brothers, Herod Antipas, had a kingdom. He's the ruler of Galilee. He's much more successful, and he's a much better catch for a woman of high ambition. And so his wife is going to divorce him and remarry, and this is going to be a hot topic of debate in first century Jewish circles. And John the Baptist is going to explicitly tell Herod Antipas that he's done something wrong by basically cheating Herod II out of his lawful wife. So that's Herod II. All in all, not very successful, ruled over no kingdom. His wife leaves him. So, in contrast to Herod II, we find his younger brother, Herod Antipas, and this Herod dominates the passages of what we call the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Herod Antipas became ruler of Galilee in 4 BC, and his reign crosses paths with both Jesus and John the Baptist frequently. Herod Antipas's affair with Herod II's wife provokes John the Baptist to declare that the entire relationship is unlawful and evil. Herod Antipas will respond by putting John the Baptist in jail and eventually having him executed. Herod Antipas is also recorded as having regretted this decision to execute John the Baptist, and this guilt is going to drive him in an interesting way. When he starts hearing news about Jesus and all of the healing powers that Jesus has, he's going to initially assume, according to Mark 6:16, that John the Baptist has risen from the dead and is now going by this Jesus name. And so it's one of the misconceptions the Bible wants you to get, that Jesus and John the Baptist are very different people. It's just Herod Antipas and people like him who think they're the same. And additionally, Luke is going to record 2 unique interactions with Jesus of Nazareth and Herod Antipas on a direct level. The first is that in Luke 13:31, the Pharisees are going to come to Jesus and they're going to warn him that Herod Antipas is plotting to kill him. Jesus will respond by calling Herod Antipas a fox, not the most belligerent term, but it's still a negative term, and he's going to assure the Pharisees that no, he's going to die in Jerusalem, not Galilee, which is Herod's territory. And then later, according to Luke 23:6-12, Herod Antipas is going to preside over a second trial of Jesus. Pontius Pilate has already tried to try Jesus once. He finds out that Jesus is a part of the Galilee jurisdiction, and he'll send him to Herod Antipas. And it's notable that during this trial, Jesus won't answer Herod Antipas a single question. And this probably demonstrates Jesus' utter contempt for the man. All right, so I'm guessing your brain is about to explode from all the people named Herod, so let's take a break and let's look at a woman of Herod's line who played a vital role in the death of John the Baptist. This woman by the name of Herodias is the primary instigator of the whole affair. And Herodias, as we mentioned earlier, is the granddaughter of Herod the Great and the daughter of Herod Aristobulus. Herodias, I should say, was originally married to Herod II, but she divorces him so that she could go live with Herod Antipas. It's unclear from Josephus in the Bible whether she actually married Herod Antipas or if they were just kind of living in this state of perpetual adultery. We don't know. But in Matthew 14:4, John the Baptist will criticize the relationship, calling it unlawful, essentially saying it is evil. Herod Antipas will put John in prison, but he's not going to attempt to harm him at first. Herodias, though, has other plans. She considered John's denouncement of her relationship as an unforgivable offense, and she's going to conspire with her young daughter to make sure that John's death comes about. And, well, speaking of that young daughter, most scholars today assume that the woman known as Salome, who's referred to in the Josephus text, is the unnamed daughter of Herodias who ultimately sealed John the Baptist's fate. Matthew 14:1-12 records the whole event, and it basically describes that Herodias' daughter is going to dance for Herod Antipas and many of his dinner guests. Now, it doesn't say exactly what this dance was, but apparently this dance was pretty sexually provocative because it's going to gain Herod's approval, making all kinds of statements saying, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Now, again, if this daughter is Salome from the Josephus text, she'd be about 14 to 17 at the time, and so the Bible may be trying to demonstrate just how sexually deviant the whole Herod family is. Not only will Herod sleep with his brother's wife, he'll also kind of make goggling impressions at his brother's wife's daughter. Now, all motives aside, when Herod promised Salome a reward for whatever she wanted for her dance, she's going to go to her mom and she says, well, what should I ask for? And her mother, Herodias, is going to say, you should ask for John the Baptist's head on a silver plate. And the biblical text seems to paint a certain amount of sympathy towards Herod Antipas at this point. He said, I'll give you whatever you want, and then he realizes that was a really stupid thing. But the Bible is also going to point out that his oath and his honor to his dinner guest is going to seem more important to him than John the Baptist's life. And so he will order John the Baptist executed, and Salome is going to present John the Baptist's head to her mother as a trophy. And so finally, here we come to the last of the first generation of Herod's children. And this is going to be a man known as Herod Philip II. And he's called the second not because he had a father, Herod Philip I, but because we want to tell the difference between Herod II, who's also called Herod Philip. And so we needed to mark that this is a different Herod from Herod II. All of the sources that you'll read in most commentaries will just simply call him Philip, just so that we can keep them separate. And sometimes they'll even call him Philip the Tetrarch, meaning he's a Philip who rules 1/4 of his father's kingdom. Now, Herod Philip is the sixth son from Herod the Great. And as far as the New Testament goes, he plays very little role. He's going to take the city known as Banias, and he's going to name it Caesarea Philippi, both after Caesar Augustus and after himself. Caesarea, Caesar, Philippi, Philip. And while the city of Caesarea Philippi is important to Jesus' earthly ministry, the city's patron founder is only mentioned briefly in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. And so he doesn't play a big point, or a part, I should say, in the narrative of the New Testament. Now, one thing that he is going to be somewhat infamous for is this Philip is going to marry Salome, the girl who asked that John the Baptist be killed. Well, so far now, we've covered all the confusing Herods of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But there's going to be other Herods mentioned in the rest of the New Testament. And these aren't going to be the first generation of Herod the Great's children. This is going to be the second and third generation of Herod the Great's children. So keep in mind that anytime the Herods you see mentioned in the book of Acts, or in anywhere else in the New Testament for that matter, that these Herods will frequently be a different set of rulers. They're not Herod the Great's children, they're Herod the Great's grandchildren. And the most notorious of these second-generation Herodian monarchs is a man known as Herod Agrippa I. He's the son of the executed Herod Aristobulus. And this Herod grew up in Rome, and he's going to have the fortune of being friend to a man named Gaius Caligula. And this man, Gaius Caligula, is going to become emperor after Tiberius dies in 37 AD. And when Caligula becomes emperor, he's going to promote his friend Herod Agrippa so that he gains all of the territory that was originally governed by his uncles, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip II, and Herod Archelaus, basically putting Herod the Great's kingdom back together. And so while all of the other Herods, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip II, Herod Archelaus, while these will all be called either tetrarchs or ethnarchs, Herod Agrippa will be called a king because his whole kingdom has been put back together for him. And this is why the New Testament and other ancient sources will call him King Agrippa. So you can tell the difference between the power level that he has, as well as to tell the difference between him and all of his uncles. Now, Herod Agrippa is famous in the New Testament for three pretty despicable actions. The first is that in Acts 12, 1-3, Herod Agrippa is going to have James, the brother of John, put to death for political reasons. The ruling Jews in Jerusalem think it's a good thing for James to have been killed, and he realizes, I can make a lot of people happy by killing the leadership of the Christians. And so the second thing he's going to do once he sees that it's profitable for him politically is he's going to put Peter in prison, and he's going to plan to put him to death as well. Now that plot will fail. Peter will be rescued by an angel, but it shows just kind of the depravity of the man. And the third thing that Herod Agrippa was known for is that he will commit a blasphemy, that he will give a speech in Caesarea Philippi, and his followers are going to say that his speech is so good that it is not just the voice of a man, it's the voice of a god. And according to both Acts chapter 12, 19-23, and in Josephus, Israel's God is going to say, enough is enough, and strike Herod Agrippa with a pretty crippling problem of the intestines. A lot of people assume that it's some kind of a tapeworm. But whatever the case, Herod is going to just immediately fall ill after this blasphemous act is done, and he's going to die 5 days later. And so, with Herod Agrippa I dead, his son is going to ascend to the throne in 44 AD, and he's going to keep that throne all the way through the Jewish War and all the way up until 100 AD. And this is Herod Agrippa II. He's going to turn out to be the last of the Herod kings, so mercifully we don't have to learn any more. But he's also remembered strangely as one of the better Herodian monarchs, at least as far as the New Testament is concerned, because it will show during Acts chapter 27 that he's fairly open-minded. He'll hear Paul and his gospel message out, and he'll even suggest that he's considering some of Paul's ideas. And while Herod Agrippa II doesn't convert to Christianity, he is willing to hear Paul out, and when he leaves the whole courtroom scene, he's going to tell the governor, a man by the name of Festus, he's going to say, we probably could have let Paul go and acquitted him. And so, of all the Herod kings, Herod Agrippa II is going to have the best press, at least as far as the New Testament is concerned. So, there you have it. Herod the Great's great dysfunctional family. If you found all this confusing, don't worry. There are plenty of good resources and various things throughout the literature I've given you, especially in your textbook on page 258. There's going to be a complete family tree of the Herods, so you don't have to keep all this straight in your head. Just remember this, though. When you're reading the New Testament and you see the name of Herod appear on the page, you need to pause and ask yourself, which Herod does the biblical author have in mind? And doing this little exercise will help you nuance many ways that the New Testament text is critiquing the power of Herod, and by extension, critiquing the power of Rome. So let's conclude with a Roman culture aspect. And if this is going to be kind of a somber note, but if there's one part of Roman culture we have to discuss where it intersects with the New Testament, it is the way that the Romans put people to death through the means of what's called crucifixion. Now, Roman era sources note that this method of execution was extremely common, but it was common for slaves and for freemen who lacked Roman citizenship. So, second-class citizens and lower, basically, are subject to this kind of treatment. It's very uncommon to read accounts of a nobleman being executed unless a Caesar signs off on it, but it is very common to hear of several thousand people being crucified at one time for things like rebellion or banditry. Now, in the New Testament, the word is stauros, which this word just gets translated cross. But this could point to many different things. It could point to a single wooden stake or pole. It could point to an uppercase X-shaped cross, or an uppercase T-shaped cross, or it could even point to the more familiar cross that is a lowercase T-shaped. So just keep in mind, this word stauros could basically refer to any kind of wood sticking up out of the ground that you're going to stick a person on. And the majority of scholars today understand that a Roman cross usually had two parts. It had the stipes, which is a large wooden pole that you just leave in the ground permanently, and you can reuse it over and over and over again. And then the second part is the patabulum, and this is a smaller piece of wood that you can attach to the stipes. And so as best we can tell, when Jesus has to carry his cross, he's being made to carry the patabulum, the smaller wooden piece. When he gets to Golgotha, he'll be nailed to the patabulum, and then the patabulum will be attached to the stipes. And so that would be the most likely way that Jesus was crucified. So, for the Romans, crucifixion served several cultural purposes. And the first was that the cross was designed to create terrible, terrible pain and suffering. And this suffering had a purpose. It was to remind both the condemned, the person who had done something wrong, and would-be lawbreakers, people who are considering doing something wrong, that Rome is in charge. Period. The end. In short, crucifixion was made to be horrible so that it could deter crime. You got someone who's thinking about rebelling against Rome? Take them out to the Appian Way or outside of Jerusalem and show them the dead bodies hanging on a cross and remind them, you step out of line, Rome is going to do this to you as well. Now, if a crucifixioner, a person who's in charge of a crucifixion, if they wanted the death of a condemned person to happen fairly quickly, they would have that person whipped first. And these whips were often large leather whips that had pieces of bone and glass and other sharp objects embedded into the leather. And so when you whip someone this way, it would cause severe blood loss, and it would basically soften them up so that they couldn't do the hard work of staying alive on the cross, and we'll get to that. But Jesus appears to have been given this treatment. He is described as being beaten and whipped many times before he's actually crucified, that is, put on a cross. And so, if you don't go through this process, a crucified person could theoretically live for many, many days if they were healthy and unscourged or unwhipped. But if they've been through this process, they could die in several hours or even minutes. And this appears to be the case with Jesus of Nazareth, that the beating and the whippings that he received basically put him in a state where he was not going to survive long on a cross. And when we talk about crosses, here's where the rubber meets the road. When it came time for a crucified person to die, the primary cause of death is not blood loss. It's exhaustion, and often exhaustion that leads to what we call asphyxiation, the inability to breathe. You see, on a cross, breathing becomes rather difficult. You're attached to this piece of wood in such a way that you don't have a easy way to open up all of your respiratory airways from your mouth and your nose all the way to your lungs. And so as the days and hours dragged on and a crucified person just hung there on a cross, they would become fatigued. And as they became fatigued, they would collapse forward. And as they collapse forward, their lungs are no longer in line with the rest of their breathing apparatus. And they begin to breathe very shallowly, and their heart has to work overtime. As this happens, they begin to deteriorate quickly, and eventually they suffocate. So in the case of Jesus' crucifixion, there's a plan that is made to break the legs of Jesus and the two robbers that are crucified with him. And if you ever wondered why would they break the legs, the simple answer is if you break a person's legs, they can't hold themselves up on the cross. Their airway becomes immediately compromised, and death tends to be a very swift process afterward, as the person on the cross just can't breathe with broken legs. Now, however, as I pointed out before, the pre-crucifixion beating that Jesus received seems to have done the trick. Jesus was already dead when the Roman soldiers get to him and try to break his legs, but they'll verify just for the record that Jesus is dead, and they will take a spear and put it through his heart. And so, if there's any question, the gospel accounts settle it. In all four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Jesus is declared absolutely dead. He suffered a terrible beating, he's been on a cross for at least 6 hours, and he's had a spear driven through his heart. The conclusion all four Gospels want you to understand, Jesus Christ is, as we would call him, clinically dead when he is removed from the cross. So let's conclude this lecture now and take a few moments and tie everything we've learned in this hour together in a nice, compact package. Here's the three main takeaways I'd like for you to get about the Romans. The first is that Rome was the powerhouse empire during the time of the New Testament. And when you read the New Testament, you need to be prepared to ask yourself these kind of questions. How does this bit of biblical data relate to Roman culture? And you'll be surprised, the more you ask yourself this question, the more that you'll find out that things like Roman politics, Roman culture, Roman philosophies, and even basic Roman ideas will interplay with the biblical text. Sometimes the text will agree with the Romans, but most of the time the text will basically challenge Roman ideas about power and empire. Secondly, all of Rome's leaders, from the Caesars all the way down to the Herods, will play a virtual role as villains in the New Testament. Whether they are depraved rulers who deny people justice, or whether they are the Caesars who demand to be worshipped as gods, nearly everything in the Gospels and nearly everything that Jesus Christ stands for seems to be in opposition to Roman power. Jesus may claim, "My kingdom is not of this earth," but his kingdom does not look like the Roman kingdom. And the Romans were very big on one thing: make all people's vision of the kingdom look like the Roman vision. And so Christianity challenges this core assumption that the Roman kingdom is necessarily the best sort of kingdom. And lastly, I want to point out that the central aspect of the Christian message, that Christ's death on the cross, became a direct challenge to Roman power. You see, by the cross, Rome showed the world that they were in charge. They showed the world they were powerful. They showed the world they were worthy of respect, awe, and fear. When a person dies on the cross, that is Rome's way of telling that person, you lose, we win. And the New Testament challenges this entire meta-narrative at its core by saying, when Rome put Jesus on the cross, he conquered death, he conquered sin, and he conquered every earthly kingdom, even Rome, not by crucifying his enemies, but by being crucified by his enemies. And this is why Paul can rightly note in 1 Corinthians 1, 17 through 19, that the cross for the Greek people is a stumbling block. The cross was the very symbol of Rome's power, but it had become a Christian symbol of hope. And this is why we still have to make a pretty interesting choice even today. theologically, we have to ask, can the cross of Christ really change the world? Does it really atone for sin? Does it really save the souls of human beings? And the New Testament provides a very provocative answer. Yes, it can, if only we will believe and have faith that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And so I want to end with this archaeological picture. This is a piece of graffiti, and here pictured on the slide on the left here. It's known as the Alexamendos graffiti, and what we see is a man praying to a person on a cross who has the head of a donkey. And the text in Greek says, Alexamendos celebrates his God, or he worships his God. Now, this is a piece of pagan graffiti that shows just how little the Christians were understood by the Romans. The Romans see a Christian worshiping a crucified man and said, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Christians look at Jesus dying on the cross and says, this gives me hope. This tells me my sins are forgiven. That's a very powerful contrast, isn't it? So keep that in mind, that this is what the Christians had to promote to the Romans, that Jesus dying on a cross could change the world. Well, that about does it for this lecture, my friends. Come back one last time and we'll conclude with our final lecture covering the lands of Galilee and the Hula Basin. Take care, my friends, and God bless you.